Hello, and welcome to our module on navigating feedback with pre-service teachers. Thank you so much for being a clinical educator and for engaging with us in supporting our URI pre-service teachers through their growing process. We know that giving feedback can be challenging, and we hope that you'll find some ideas within this module that can provide supports for you. So first of all, I want to frame the goal of feedback is to give students information about their performance relative to a particular learning objective so that they can improve performance and understand themselves better as learners, and in this case, teachers. Um, there's a lot embedded here that we need to unpack, and so we'll get into that as we move forward. In particular, our goal as supervisors and mentors is to move our pre-service teachers along the continuum from where many of them start with a fixed mindset into a growth mindset as we help them develop their own self-regulated learning. That is, we want to give feedback that will provide them with the structure and opportunity to begin to set their own goals and look critically at their own practice so that they are finding and reflecting on ways that they can grow and meet the needs of their students. I think it's important to think of this um, model as we go, although we would like for their growth to be this beautiful straight upward line. From the beginning of the year to the end of the year, it really is wavy, and there is growth and growth and setback all along the way. But our goal is to move them from their dependence on us into a more interdependent, where we're sharing in that. And you can see it, we go from a more coaching model to a more collaborating model over time. Um, and then there's these ideas along the bottom of ways that we can help move them around along the curriculum, starting with a lot of modeling, a lot of recommending, and moving toward more affirmation. And although I don't really like the term praise in a coaching and collaboration model, it's something to consider. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through. Um, Wiggins and McTeague do a great job with backward planning, and part of what they talk about in terms of the importance of feedback is that it is concrete, specific, and useful, that it provides actionable information. It provides something that the students can do or try, some direction in which they can move. Sometimes we aren't very good at articulating what it is we need to see them do. And there are ways to help us get better at doing that. Because if we give very nebulous feedback, oh, that was good. Oh, your lesson really lost them in the middle. That doesn't provide those next steps. It's not getting at the why the big thing happened, whether it was for good or whether it was for not so good. I think there are a couple of common misconceptions. I talked about I'm not loving the use of the word praise, even in that first model, but I love the rest of it. Praising someone is not giving feedback. So it's not that we can't praise them. Certainly, we all want affirmation of the things that we do well, but feedback is more specific than that. And feedback is also not necessarily tied to evaluation. And I think we need to help, especially our students, figure that out. When I say they need to work on their wait time, I'm not saying they're a bad teacher. A lot of times they jump to that conclusion. So we have to help them work through those feelings of being evaluated when they're actually just receiving feedback. Okay, so when it comes to effective classroom feedback, it is corrective in that we want to shift something in a more productive direction. Um, so we're readjusting, not in a way like you're doing a terrible job, more in the way of, I like to think of when I taught my kids to drive, um, it wasn't good to be like, "Ah, you're going off the road." It needed to be a much more gentle correction. "I need you to move a little bit more toward the center line," or "I need you to move a little away from the center line," depending on which child it was. So we're trying this gentle nudge in terms of correcting them to move in a more productive direction. It's also developmentally appropriate. We can't ask them to work on wait time if they aren't even engaging with the class. Um, so we have to think about developmentally what is a logical next step for this student teacher or this resident, even if everyone else typically is in a different spot. So we need to adjust to the individual development of our residents that are in our classroom. And this last one on this slide, don't worry, we have three more aspects of effective classroom feedback, but the last one on this first slide is really critical. And it's really hard. Our feedback has to be objective to a criterion, not to other residents, not to other teachers. So for us, we highly recommend that you use the Rhode Island Professional Teaching Standards, the RIPETs, so that when you're giving feedback, you can tie what you're doing directly to an expectation. And those RIPET standards are broad enough that you can look at some aspect of instruction within that standard and say, this is where I'm not seeing the growth that I need to see. And so we need to work on planning in a way that differentiates for the needs of the students in this classroom. And then we can dig into what that looks like. But again, this is really hard, especially for those of you who have been working with us and with other student teachers for a long time to not give feedback in terms of where student teachers typically are at this point in time. There's a time and a place for that. But in terms of building this opportunity for feedback and for critical feedback, we want what we give to be tied to a specific criteria. Okay, so it is also timely. This is really super important for those of you who are working side by side with our residents in your classrooms. The sooner you can come back to it at an appropriate point. So maybe when the kids are doing some independent work, or when you have a little bit of planning time, or after school, whatever it is, but giving that feedback in a timely manner. I have found that in working with residents and student teachers, using Post-it notes, if they are taking the lead in teaching and I'm gonna sit back and observe a little bit, or maybe even stand at the back of the room and help some of my uh, folks that are that I know in my class need support, I might take some Post-its with me and write out some feedback as I'm watching and supporting my students, and just leave that Post-it note on my resident's desk. But timeliness is critical. Um, Again, it's actionable. That goes back to that Wiggins and McTeague. Uh, it is helpful for us to follow up our feedback with a resource or something they can do. So I'll use wait time again. So I've tied it to the RIPET standard of instruction and setting up an engaging classroom. I said, but you need to be more effective in wait time. You're waiting about 1 second before you either move on or you call on somebody else after you've asked a question. So what I would like you to try to do tomorrow when you teach is to count to 5. And what you might do before then is just practice counting to 5 to see how long that feels, so that when you're standing in the front of the class, it doesn't feel as awkward because 5 seconds is a long time to stand in silence in the front of the class. So not only have I given them feedback tied to the RIPET standard of instruction, but I have also given them an action. I want them to try counting to 5, and I want them to try before they get to the front of the class just so they can get a sense of how long that is. This last item about effective classroom feedback is tied closely to actionable. It should spur reflection in the student. So thinking about the importance of wait time, maybe following up and noticing how students react differently when they implement wait time. There should be some thinking that takes place. Sometimes we might need to facilitate that. Reflection, we are finding, is not something that our students, that comes second nature to our students. It's not something they all engage readily with. And so sometimes we have to facilitate that, whether it's in verbal interactions or in a note that we write or in our written feedback. We need to help them think through those things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. In terms of the process for giving feedback, I always start with asking the student teacher, or the resident to give their own assessment of what they thought of whatever it was they just did. Tell me what you thought about that. Tell me what went well. Things like that. There are other reflection starters that you can use, and I've just listed some here. There's nothing magical about this, but these are statements that the residents or student teachers can use. Tell me, if I were asking them instead, I might say, tell me what you noticed. If you were to do this again, tell me what you might do differently. Tell me what you're pleased with. Tell me what you're working through or what you're problem solving. Or you could actually give this list of reflection starters to your resident and have them pick and choose. Maybe pick 2 that they want to use to start our quick discussion. Another option is, as you're mentoring, you can use questioning with those response starters, flipping them around to kind of elicit more reflection. You can use 2 stars and a wish. After I ask the resident to talk about things, I often say, okay, I hear what you're saying, and I have my 2 stars and a wish. I'm going to tell you 2 things that I think you did well. Again, I'm going to tie them to the RIPET standards, and I'm going to give you 1 thing that I wish you could work on. And that's going to be something that is actionable. It's going to be concrete, and they're going to be able to work on that, hopefully, the very next day. There's also goal setting and picking 1 or 2 broad goals to work on, whether it's in collaboration with your resident or they're setting the goals. That can really help zoom in on a manageable task to take on, to reflect on, to concentrate on, when probably in teaching, as you know, we could pick a million things to work on any given day. So goal setting helps narrow that, especially for our novices. So I do that in building off of the resident self-assessment and then guiding their choice for setting a focus goal or 2. One of the key things that I think sometimes we forget to do is to circle back. So always starting the next conversation with the resident's assessment of their focus goals and how they're progressing on that. So when I talk to them again, I'll say, let's start with maybe how you think that went. How do you think it went in relation to the goals that you set for yourself? And the wait time goal, we'll just come back to that. How do you feel like you're doing on your wait time? What evidence do you have to support that? What have you noticed that the students have done in response to that? Those kinds of things. Um, so that's the process, and it's ongoing throughout the year now that they are with you in your classrooms. So what we want to talk through real quick are the expectations for giving residents feedback in the fall, and then we'll talk about the spring. There is informal and formal ways, and you, as the clinical educator, are mostly giving informal feedback after lessons that your resident leads, daily or weekly in general. Um, Maybe they do a small group while you're doing other things. We know that you're watching them and keeping an eye on them. This kind of feedback is typically oral, but if you want them to work on anything in particular, it's typical to put it in writing. Um, if for some reason something isn't going well and your resident isn't progressing as we would expect, having this kind of documentation that shows you've given feedback, you've talked about it regularly, and they're not making progress is super helpful in helping us make decisions as we go. So I advocate for simply a follow-up email, maybe at the end of the day, on things that you really want them to focus on. Again, you can keep maybe a post-it if you keep a copy, but you want documentation of anything that you're really asking them to work on. I would advocate that you include the student's university supervisor on any emails that you write to the student, just because that's such an important trio of people, you, the university supervisor, and our resident. And it's critical that all of you be on the same page in terms of what you're expecting. Everybody knows what you're seeing in order to be able to best support this resident and you. Our amazing clinical educators in the classrooms. And certainly, if you start seeing any concerns, especially as our students are in your classrooms for longer during the fall, email the university supervisor with any concerns that you see. We are going to be trying to move to a much more proactive role. I think in the past, because of the structure, we've had to be more reactive, where the university comes in and supports only when the problem has gotten to the point that's big enough that everybody's frustrated, and we want to intervene before that. So our university supervisors will be in your classrooms in the fall. We're hoping that facilitates much more conversation and support, but please feel free to email with any concerns. In the fall, you will have the opportunity to do a formal observation in conjunction with the university supervisor. That means you will both be watching the resident teach a lesson. You'll watch the same lesson. You'll talk about the evaluation of it so that there is this baseline of understanding between the clinical educator and the university supervisor in terms of what the expectations are in the classroom in relation to the RIPET standards and our evaluation process. We will also ask you to formally review progression to residency 2 evaluation. We will have that again. It's based in standards. We need comments to support your evaluation, particularly if a student is approaching or not meeting expectations. The more detail you can put in there, going back to your informal feedback, pulling from that, the better it is. We don't expect that our residents will be glowing in all areas. They are novice teachers that are just beginning. So the feedback that you give them as the people that are spending so much time with them in your classroom is critical. In the spring, we are still doing that informal process. You're still talking to them weekly. You're they're taking on more authority and more independence, and maybe they're leading more lessons. You have more opportunity to observe them and to give feedback. Formally, you are doing 3 or more formal observations with written feedback. Again, I suggest putting written feedback either in the evaluation um, or in an email that includes both the university supervisor and um, the resident. You're posting to TaskStream with some of these things. There will be a midterm meeting with you and the university supervisor and the resident in which you talk about these things. There is a ProCAD evaluation, which we talked about in the university supervisor orientation and in the clinical educator orientation. Um, that addresses those competencies, attitudes, and dispositions. We ask you to evaluate your resident in relation to that. And then there is a final evaluation that, again, you post a TaskStream with comments. The more comments that you can include, the more meaningful it is. We know that every year there are students who raise some concerns. Again, we hope that we address those early. We hope that we're able to be proactive in providing some more support for our resident to be successful in the fall so that they can continue in the spring. But if there are concerns, we always say start with the resident directly and then inform and coordinate with the university supervisor. So again, this is the support that you have um, at your fingertips, the university supervisor. There is a professional improvement Google form that you can link to when we give you this presentation link that documents an issue with particularly the ProCADs, but any competency, attitude, or disposition that you have a concern with. It can be that our resident is showing up 20 minutes late every day for their fall residency. When they've said they're going to be there at 9 a.m., they're not showing up till 9:30. They're not telling you they're going to be late. Hopefully it's issues like that that we can deal with and not super extreme issues that we need to jump in and really think about in a different way. Specifically at the end of the fall semester, although this can certainly happen at any time, we may ask you to contribute to a professional improvement plan that will be designed by the university supervisor and the program coordinator in conjunction with you. To specifically document where the student or resident needs to grow in relation to RIPET standards or ProCAD expectations, and what supports are in place for to help the resident move in that direction. Again, I cannot overemphasize how important it is to document, especially if there are concerns. Document what you're seeing, document that you're having conversations so the resident is aware of your concerns, document that the university supervisor is aware of the concerns, document anything you do to try to support, all of those things, just so we have those resources in terms of moving forward and knowing what's been done and making sure that everyone is informed. So I'm going to try to summarize 3 major takeaways that I want you to walk away and kind of keep in the back of your head. First of all, feedback has to be tied to a criterion or a standard. The RIPET standards, the ProCAD expectations are good places to start. Number 2, feedback should be timely. We can't wait a week for formal feedback on a lesson that was done on Monday. It has to be more timely. Research tells us that within a day is the best time frame. And feedback should be actionable. We need to give our residents a little bit of guidance. So here's what I need you to do, and here's a resource for you to think about it. Maybe it's a video online. Maybe they need to do a little extra research. Maybe it's tied to a class. Um, there's lots of things that can be provided so that they can take that next step. And then we have some resources for you if you're really interested in feedback and learning more about it. Uh, our own Kathy Pino has developed this POM method, and you can find more about this particular model in the resources on our Clinical Educator Education webpage. And these are 3 books that have that do include aspects of giving meaningful feedback within it. And we would advocate reading those or reading pieces of those, searching online to read pieces of those. Thank you so much. Also, if you have any questions, I am here as the Associate Dean of Teacher Education to be a resource for you. I am happy to answer questions, provide insight, or talk more about any questions you have regarding feedback. Thank you so much for your time and your efforts in supporting our residents.